Hi Year 12 and welcome to your feedback for your second assessment task for economics. I'll start off by saying it was fairly obvious that everybody gave both sections a really good go. A little bit of work to do in terms of our sequencing of ideas for the first section, the flow diagram section, and we'll talk about that further. And I think the fact that you could semi-prepare for those extended responses really helped you to write some quality responses. But let's start. So you should have this printed out. Make sure you have a pen and a highlighter. Make sure you have your work in front of you as well. And we will have a look through this feedback now. So the first section were your flow diagrams, and you were asked to look at a bilateral and a multilateral agreement. In terms of the features, which was that first section that you needed to do, you needed to be quite specific, because if you weren't specific, you weren't then able to draw out the economic implications from that. And many diagrams gave general ideas, but most responses gave, general features without actually giving a specific point or a specific stat to go with that. Better responses did, though, look at features that affected both the trade of goods and services, and many responses only focused on goods. It reminds me a little bit of that idea of trade and financial flows. We're all happy to talk about trade in terms of those tactile goods, but we often forget that services or those financial flows. So something to note, okay? Have a look at your work now. This is just an example of really clear, specific, and measurable features. Okay, so this is from someone's flow diagram. They are saying the gradual elimination of the 20% tariff on dairy products by January 2026. And you can see that that goes through. They've given 3 very clear features. I would have said that 3 to 4 features would have been roughly where you should have been looking. And then obviously they sequence their ideas from there. So just have a look at your features and think, were they as specific and measurable as the ones given here? So rate your use and selection of specific yet varied features. Okay, were yours specific or were they general? But also, did you have that variety as well, or were the features that you provided quite narrow? Okay. The second area that you were asked to look at were impacts. Many responses attempted to give varying impacts, which is good. It is important, though, to remember and relate it back to economic concepts, linking to ideas like employment, trade balances, economic growth, show economic implications. Better responses very clearly linked the impacts to the feature. So it wasn't like the feature was given and then, oh, here are some general impacts. It was because of this feature, this is going to be the economic impact from that. And that idea of that flow diagram was to show that relationship, okay, to connect your ideas. Here's a bit of an example for you. So have a bit of a read of this, okay. You will see that there is this idea of decreased tariffs, and then it goes through and it supports it with evidence. Okay, so have a read of these and then think about your impact section, and did you clearly link yours as well as this one does? So again, have a bit of a reflection, read through your own impact section of your flow diagrams. How would you rate your level of detail, but also your use of economic concepts? A little note that you might want to add here is, did you clearly link it to the feature that you had already given? Okay, data and evidence was the next kind of idea that you needed to have integrated, and at times responses were quite general. It was vital that you give some idea of measurable impact, even if it was forecasted impact. So if you did the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement as your bilateral, it's only recently been implemented. A lot of those tariff reductions actually haven't come into full effect yet. But you would need to try and find the forecasted impact and then state that, okay? Some responses provided data, but they just gave data and they didn't actually link it to, well, the feature and the impact. The point of this was so that you started to see this idea of economic sequencing. This is the feature, this is the impact, this is how we're going to measure it. And a few of us really missed that. Here's a great example for you. Okay, so looking at Chapter, looking at investors as well, which is great to see. Okay, not just looking at tactile goods, and then have a look at the data and therefore the implications as well. So, look at your use of data. Did you mention it or did you explore it? But also, again, maybe put a little star or an asterisk. Did you link it clearly to the feature and the impact area? Okay. So, in terms of this, we need to focus on sequencing our economic ideas, and this kind of flow diagram is really trying to get you to think about how would you order things within a paragraph. Okay, if you were given a short answer or an extended response on a concept like this, how are you linking your ideas? So, i.e. that the features as a cause and then the impact areas obviously are your effects. Okay, but again, this idea of critique, yeah, positive and negative, yeah, many people just looked at the benefits, not any limitations. It's important that we link free trade agreements to concepts like employment, trade balance, and growth. And it's really important that we show that we can apply our understanding, not just recall. So, to me, this student's diagram was the most logical in terms of its layout. Overarching feature, specific features, down into impacts, okay? It was not perfect, especially this bit here. They really needed to prove this a little bit more. But just have a look at your diagram and did you sequence your economic ideas as clearly as this diagram here? All right, so how clear was your flow diagram? Have a bit of a reflection. Did it sequence your economic ideas to show causes and economic consequences? Rate yourself now, yeah? You've got that 1 to 10, you've got that yes, no, maybe, etc. Okay, we're now going to move to the extended response, and the question was, explain how recent changes in the global economy impact Australia's trade and financial flows. So essentially, you might want to annotate this on your page. The changes in the global economy is the cause, and we want our impact or effect areas to be on trade and financial flows. So, what constitutes recent? I don't have an answer for you. I would be saying going back as the global financial crisis, so you're looking at, 08 there, is probably as far back as you want to go, okay, because we're getting now that that's 10, 11 years ago. The other thing that I would encourage you to think about is, were your changes relevant, but did it also show a broad scope of knowledge? Or were you very limited in terms of all you wrote about was really China? Because if all you're writing about is China, yeah, they're important, but are you showing that marker, that high band 5, band 6 scope of knowledge? And the answer is really no. So, these were some changes that I thought of, and many of you wrote on a couple of them. You could talk about the increase in protectionism globally, led by Trump, Brexit, and how this change is actually a move away from the World Trade Organization's focus on trade liberalization. Many of you wrote about the slowing and moderating growth in China, which is awesome. Linking that to our export base makes a lot of sense. A few of you also spoke about an increase in bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, and often regional. Again, this is good, but you needed to draw that out as a change. Okay, many of you just kind of were talking, trade agreements, and then you just went into trade and financial flows. You do need to spend some time exploring the change, okay, which is essentially the cause. You could talk about globalization and increasing interconnections with geographic neighbours, and you might want to annotate that one here. This one is really important for financial flows, and that was, and we'll get to it in further detail, that was still our area of weakness. We've definitely improved, but we've still got work to do there. The other one, which we're going to look at, is the Eurozone instability, Brexit, the European Union, the European sovereign debt crisis, etc. And that one was really not covered by anybody in great detail. So we'll do some work on increasing your knowledge and understanding in that as well. So let's talk about the impact on Australia's trade flows first. Both exports and imports needed to be addressed, and imports were pretty much ignored. You need to know and remember that trade flows both into and out of Australia. And if all you're writing about is our exports, you're missing half the picture. The other idea that you need to remember is there is both composition and direction. Many responses inferred or kind of alluded to, but did not clearly say things like our mineral and metals heavy export base. The fact that we have a significant relationship with China in terms of both imports and exports. Exports obviously more so than imports. You really needed to make clear this idea of imports and our importation of consumer goods, intermediate goods, and why does Australia import them, and how would one of those or multiple one of those changes impact that? So, data and evidence was definitely needed to show how the change has impacted both X and or M. So again, comparative data is always better. Before the change, after the change, something over time, etc. Looking at free trade agreements and globalizations really could have helped link with the change in the direction. So looking at historically where Australia imported and exported to, and more recently. And you could look at the idea of regional agreements that Australia has entered into the Australia Pacific, and how the rise of Asian economies has really allowed for Australia to take advantage of those growing markets. I want you to think now and write down maybe 5 dot points on what content could or should you have included in relation to imports. If you need to open up your notes, that's fine, but pause now and have a go at that. Okay, still on trade. It was good to see people linking to things like BOGs and CAD and balance of payments, and this shows the marker you know your stuff. Don't forget about the ideas relating to a trade surplus adding to economic growth, which is what we've currently got, as well as the idea of employment. So labour as a derived demand, where are our, what are we exporting? The actual increase in services as an export really wasn't looked at much either. You could have used measures like the terms of trade and the trade weighted index just to show, again, that breadth of knowledge. Better responses looked at ideas like this. So, a greater focus and really kind of making it clear to the market that you know that Australia has a narrow export base would have been great. 55% of Australia's exports in 2017-18 were minerals and metals. And you could link this directly to a moderating growth in China, okay, and therefore the demand from China having a significant impact. You could also look at the importance of commodity prices on Australia's trade flows as well. In 2017-18, 26% of total imports were consumer goods, compared to 15.6% in 1981-82. Why? What change has happened? Well, globalization, the reliance on low-cost production countries to produce consumer goods has really driven Australia to import these goods. No one really looked at this, and it's something that we need to address moving forward. So I'm not going to read this to you. This was quite a clear paragraph. It wasn't perfect, but it had some good ideas on free trade agreements. It had some good measures. It wasn't explored in enough detail, but have a read of this now. It might give you an idea of what you could have included or how you could have worded a particular paragraph of yours. All right, I want you to have a look through your response now. Look at your sections, particularly on trade, and think about what were your strengths and your weaknesses. Add in a couple of dot points. You may even want to write yourself a to-do list. I need to go over this, and this. So pause now and have a go at that. Okay, moving on to the second part of the question, which was the recent changes impacting financial flows. The rate of financial flows has been much greater than the movement of goods. International businesses, buying and selling assets, investments, super important, and no response really drew out how financial flows have increased at a much greater rate than trade flows, and we need to show the market that we understand that financial flows are significant for the Australian economy, but also they are actually have undergone more change than the trade in goods and services. Greater focus was needed on the difference between portfolio and direct investment. Show the market you know your stuff. Show the market that you know the difference. Back it up with a stat. An explanation of how a change has seen an increase in portfolio and direct investment would have been good. So due to Eurozone instability, Australia has become a more attractive investment option. Link it with our AAA credit rating, and therefore we see this direct investment coming from Europe into Australia. Better responses again would have drawn out some links of this to the net primary and therefore obviously our CAD and the inflow on the financial account as well. But that's showing that connection. That's showing you going outside and thinking what economic concepts relate to this. And that's what we need to be doing if we want that high band 5 or band 6. So I'm not going to read this paragraph to you, but this is an example of relevant content. So think about maybe a change being the mining boom and post-mining boom readjustment. You could link this to the moderating growth in China, the structural change in the Australian economy, and just have a read of this. Maybe highlight it and think, how could I have used some of this information in my response? So pause and do that now. Many responses didn't connect to the exchange rate at all, and remember the Forex market and currency trading is an important part of financial flows into and out of the Australian economy. We have a strong, stable financial system. It's an attractive investment option. Don't quote me, but I think we're the 5th most traded currency because of that stability. Okay. And again, very little given on this, so have a look at that. This might be on your to-do list, which is to go over. Again, I won't read this to you. You can pause it now, but have a look at this. Okay, have a look at this. Again, content that you could have used. It's not done. It's not a finished paragraph, but it kind of gives you the idea of what information may have been good for you to include for this financial flow section. So pause now and have a read. It was a bit of a shame, again, like imports, that no response really dealt with Aussie investment into other economies. So this idea of Australian investment abroad. Remember, financial flows go both ways, into and out of. So looking at this, the Australian investment abroad has grown significantly, okay? And we look at this idea of linking it maybe to globalization, linking it to the increased integration with our regional partners through other trade agreements, yeah. So don't forget, trade agreements will also often have clauses in there about investment, okay? And it would be great to see us maybe try and look at trade and financial flows within the same paragraph, especially if we're talking about free trade agreements, being those regional and multilateral. Have a read of this paragraph now. It's got some really clear content. on financial flows. It's got some data on financial flows. So have a read now. You can see here that the structure probably needed to have a new paragraph. So just take that into account whilst you're reading it. But just think about what this paragraph is supplying that maybe your response didn't. So one of the things as I was reading was I felt like we were very China heavy. And I suppose that's in relation to the fact that I've talked a lot about China. You've probably read more about China than anywhere else. But we really lacked any connection to Europe. And in particular for financial flows, Europe is really important. 1.8 billion in combined investment between the EU and Australia in 2017. So China is not as significant. In terms of our trade flows, yes, China's the top dog. But in terms of our financial flows, Europe, okay, and even Japan is more important here. So we are going to have a session on EU and Brexit, and we're going to look at financial flows. But just have a look in your response and maybe make a little comment down here of, were you too China focused? And it's not necessarily a bad thing that you know that much about China, but coming back to that idea that I spoke about at the start is, did you have that scope, that breadth of knowledge? All right, so just like you did for trade, pause now. What were your strengths with financial flows? Everyone wrote about financial flows, so that's the first thing. But what were your weaknesses? What do you need to work on? And hopefully you can pick a key few areas to really work on for financial flows. So pause and do that now. Okay, overall, I want you to write 3 areas that you want to improve on, but underneath, I want you to come up with 1 active strategy. So you might want to improve on your knowledge of exchange rates within financial flows. Okay, well, what are you going to do to achieve that? Okay, so have a go at that now. We're then going to talk about this slide together. We're going to meet one-on-one and we're going to look at your 3 areas and what you want to do, and I'm going to figure out how I'm going to help you do that. Lastly, I want you to write a reflection. Think about your own attempt. Think about maybe your performance and have a bit of a reflection. So it's, think maybe like diary entry type thing, and we'll have a little bit of a chat on how you felt like you attempted or approached it, and how you're feeling towards your performance. All right, guys, hopefully you've got a bit out of this, and we will talk in person. Thanks, Year 12.